Hey there, welcome to another episode of Rightly Dividing the Word of Truth. Down here with Asher, my producer at his Duluth Creative Studios and company, and we are going to come with our next episode. And as we have been trying to link all these together, we looked at how to read the Bible, how to study it, the importance of that to get the understanding, and then we talked about God's grace and how it came to us through the cross of Christ and the mechanics of that. But then we also saw that it took the wrath, Christ to receive the wrath of God. And that's where we left off, and we saw that wrath, and it's kind of something that maybe doesn't bring us a lot of comfort to think about it, but it's a reality. And so what I want us to do now is to kind of pivot a little bit to see why the things seem to be so out of control. If there's a God who's in control of all this, why doesn't it seem like that? So I hope that we can start to answer some of these things, and we'll start with this in this episode. So we'll see you then. You are listening to Rightly Dividing the Word of Truth. I'm Kevin Severio. The aim of this show is to provide a simple, God-prescribed way to study the Bible to see the timeless relevance of His eternal purpose for heaven and earth and where we fit into it. I want to invite you to join in as we study how to fit the pieces together to see God for who He is, a God of grace and love, and how that grace and love will motivate your life. My hope is that this show will illuminate the highest form of love we can and will ever know, how that Christ Jesus loved us and gave Himself for us. Hey there. All right. So we're going to pick up from the intro, talking about some things. We're going to use this as a guide for pretty much the whole episode, but I'm going to just read a few things to you because we were, talking about in the intro and this is something that all of us here on planet Earth have to be wondering, and we all do. Like, is there really anybody in control when everything seems to be so out of control? Or everything seems to go wrong, we have to force things to go right, and just seems like evil prevails. And it's not a very comforting thought, but I think we all know that this is reality. And so I know it is a struggle, and it was for me for a long time. And I know it is for many to really believe that there's a God who's in control, and that there could actually be a God that would care for humanity. We were the last 3 or 4 episodes, we kind of link things together, and we look at God's, His love and His grace, and how that came to us through the cross of Christ, and the mechanics of that. And we kind of made a big deal of how to study the Bible. We rightly divide the word of truth to really get put it in its context to get the understanding. But then we came upon this thing of God's wrath, and it's kind of troubling. And I'm not really. I don't want to go back and do a review of that, but I do want to kind of pick up with, in order to see the chaos that has gone on planet Earth. And God's seemingly anger and wrath towards that. And the question is, it's just got to be a natural question that we all have. I know I did even when I was just real young. Why? Like, why all the evil? We all would just want things to be better. And I'm just going to read 2 passages, and then we're going to kind of get into answering that question. Where did evil come from? Why does it have to exist? And if there is a God, isn't He in control? Because it sure doesn't seem like it. Well, if we go to Isaiah chapter 13, this here it's kind of scary when you read it. The first word it's Isaiah chapter 13, verse 6. It says, "Howl ye." Like, whoa, howl, that's a pretty strong word, right? "For the day of the Lord is at hand. It shall come as a destruction from the Almighty. Therefore shall all hands be faint, and every man's heart shall melt. This is pretty intense stuff. Why? Why is that going to happen? And they shall be afraid, pangs and sorrow shall take hold of them. They shall be in pain as a woman that travaileth. They shall be amazed one at another. Their faces shall be as flames. Wow. We don't read things like that often, but they're in the Bible. Behold, the day of the Lord cometh, cruel, both with wrath and fierce anger, to lay the land desolate, and he shall destroy the sinners thereof. For the stars of heaven and the constellations thereof shall not give their light. The sun shall be darkened in his going forth, and the moon shall not cause her light to be shine. And I will punish the world for their evil, and the wicked for their iniquity. Enough. I mean, that just goes on. And as I've told you plenty of times now, a lot of that's spoken a lot in the Bible, the Old Testament prophets, that they prophesize a lot about the coming of God's wrath. And I'm going to just go over to Revelations and read one more. And yeah, you've heard about the fire and brimstone preachers, right? Well, where did that term come from, fire and brimstone? Well, it's in the Bible. And again, it's not something I like hearing about, but, some pound the Bible and they preach it, heaven pure and hell hot, right? But here you go in Revelations 14, verse 10, it says, the same shall, verse 9 says, and the third angel followed them, saying with a loud voice, and many, and any that worship the beast in his image and received his mark in his forehead or in his hand, the same shall drink of the wine of the wrath of God, which is poured out without mixture into the cup of his indignation. Yikes. Without mixture. Remember I told you about the cup of God's wrath was just filling up drop by drop, and the murder of his son was the sin that caused it to boil over. And here it is in the book of Revelations. You see that happening. Remember, I told you there's going to be a payback for that murder. And he shall be tormented with fire and brimstone in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. And it says, and their smoke of their torment ascendeth up forever and ever. Enough again. We could read on more of that. The fire and brimstone. So, yeah, and I think that a lot of people on the earth, they struggle with thinking, well, there's an angry God and there's a bunch of evil. It doesn't seem like nobody's in control. Yeah, and it's kind of sad because that is what it seems like. And so all that wrath, we learned that that was all poured out first on the cross, the physical cross of Jesus, the Lord Jesus, and then into hell where he experienced that second death and that fire and brimstone as he was making a payment for our sin. That's why the world didn't get that wrath that I'm reading about. That's why none of this has happened yet, because Christ took it all, and now God's able to he's able to long suffer and extend grace and forgiveness through that sacrifice that Christ made, and it's just by faith. So we went over that. And grace, I told you that it has the meaning of it's all God's free to do for us through the cross of Christ, but it also is to get what you don't deserve. It's an unmerited favor that God gives with delight. The world deserved God's wrath for the murder of his son, but instead of that wrath, they got his grace because his son took all the wrath. And just in reading that, what Isaiah 13 and Revelations 14, that's the coming wrath. This dispensation of the grace of God, which we saw last episode, will not last forever. And there's not a timeline to where it ends, but there is a point where, in past periods in human history, where periods ended. Why? Because there was no faith in who God was dealing with, whether it was the nations, the Gentiles on the earth, or whether it was his own nation, Israel, and he turned from them. Well, he's turned now in the dispensation of the grace of God to all nations. And this dispensation will end like the others ended, when there's no faith in what? In Christ dying for humanity's sins. And then that's when that wrath will be dispensed. Now, that wrath, again, is part of the question I asked, why all this chaos? Well, in order to really get an answer to that and to understand it, we have to go back not just to the beginning, but we have to go back to before time was. And so I have this little thing, and of course, this is just a notepad, right? So we can't try to illustrate God in space on this notepad. So we have to kind of use this as a guide to think outside of this notepad into infinity, right? Where things don't end. So when we think about Einstein, he had the theory of relativity, right? And we know that accounts for, he accounted for 3 dimensions of space. He accounted for length, he accounted for height, and width, or the breadth. He didn't count for depth, but he just considered height and depth being the same thing. So you have those 3 dimensions of the continuum of space. Now, before the earth was created in Genesis 1, there was just, I'm going to say those 4 dimensions of space. Now, we're going to say there's going to be a 5th dimension that will be added. But what we're going to look at right now, it's that 5th dimension isn't here. Why? Well, the 5th dimension is time. Time's going to be inside of where we live, Earth. We're not looking at that right now. We're outside of Earth in the continuum of everlasting. Where these dimensions, the dimensions of height, it's everlasting. It doesn't end. It's where the east meets the west. It doesn't end. The dimension of length, it doesn't end. It's everlasting. The earth has a dimension that ends. If you can go around the earth, the outside of the earth into the universe, you can't. You could just keep going straight and go forever in the space. And the depth of it, the same thing. You could just keep going down, or the height, you could just keep going up, or the breadth of it, the width of it, it could just go out. That's just space. Now, those are the dimensions that account for space, but they're infinite. They go on forever. Now, what fills up that space? The space being everything. It's everlasting. It doesn't end. It's vast. God fills this space because God is the same thing. He's everlasting. He's from everlasting to everlasting. He has no end. He has no beginning. He fills the whole space, which is eternal. It doesn't end. So what I'm talking about, we have to, in order to understand where all this craziness came from that we know on this earth, we have to know what went on before, outside of this earth, in eternity past. In eternity past, God, he filled this continuum. He fills the continuum of everlasting. He didn't come from anywhere. He's always been. I know that's a concept, and these related concepts, they're kind of hard to get your mind around, but not really if you sit and contemplate them. If you look in the scriptures and you start putting some things together, you can start getting an idea of, like, we're suspended in the universe on a planet that has a foundation that it sits on. Somebody made that. We're going to look at this, but so as God fills this space, and if you look at the word God, it only means authority. Like, it doesn't, like, God doesn't mean, it's not a specific thing. It's, the word God means authority. And so when you think of God, you think of the authority and a throne. Those all are the same: God, authority, and throne. God fills this space as that. He's the authority. Why? Because he's the creator of everything. Now we're going to see in this space, God's going to, as the authority, he's going to become creator. He's going to create some stuff inside of the space that we know of as the universe, and Earth being part of that universe. And so as we're going back before that, we're going to go back to the book of Job. The book of Job is actually the oldest book in the Bible. It's not, the book isn't put together in sequential, or it's not even put together chronological. It's put together dispensationally. So they're not in the sequential order as by date. That's not how the Bible was put together. Job was the oldest book written in the Bible. And that's why in the book of Job, there's a lot about creation in it. And there's some things that you don't even find in the book of Genesis about creation. But if we go to the book of Job and we read and we're in chapter 38, Job, was having all these problems, and he thought he had some answers to them, and he had some friends who were trying to give him some advice. But then God finally speaks in chapter 38 about Job's situation. We'll just pick it up at verse 1. He says, "Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, Who is this that darkeneth counsel by words without knowledge? Gird up now thy loins like a man, for I will demand of thee, and answer thou me." He's talking to Job. As the man, he should have known about creation and what was going on. Verse 4, where was thou where was thou, he's asking Job, where were you at when I, God, laid the foundation of the earth? Declare if thou has understanding. So he's asking Job, were you there when I laid the foundations of the earth? And obviously Job wasn't. Then he says in verse 5, who hath laid the measures thereof? We have math on the earth, and we see that through math, great things have been done by man on the earth. But really, God is the personification of math. When he laid out the universe and started to construct it, he used mathematical formulas and equations. He laid out the measure. He had a foundation. So this was geometry, and he would have had to have been an architect as far as drawing up blueprints before he started to construct the universe. And so he has the measures. He's measuring the dimension, as he's going to make this, as he's creating the universe inside of space. And he says, if thou knowest, or who has stretched the line upon it, measurements. So God, when he was constructing it, he did it as an architect. And he was not only the architect that designed the blueprints, he was the contractor. He constructed it with himself, with his hands. He did it through math. Whereupon are the foundations thereof fastened. Fastened, just like you're using a nail gun, or you're putting things together, you're welding, all these different ways of fasten as he's putting the earth together in space. And he's got this foundation, and he's got the earth, and he's got all these measurements of the earth. In the book of Proverbs, it says that he used the compass, for the four, directions. He says, or who had laid the cornerstone thereof? One of the things I used to do was lay block and brick as a mason. And the one thing that when you do that is you always have to start with a corner. You have to start with your corner, and then you build from there. So you establish the corner, and then you can start hanging your lines, and you can build to that. And so that's the same idea as the foundations of the earth. God had the cornerstone first, and from there, he was able to build that foundation and put the earth on top of that foundation. Now, in saying all that, so all this was going on, but before God started to create the universe and the earth in the universe, he already had created something else. Look, verse 7 says, now when all this was happening, when God was putting together the universe, he says, when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy. The morning stars and the sons of God in the Bible are often referred to as the angels, the angelic creation. Angels, cherubims, these are the angelic beings that God created. And in the book of Hebrews, it says that they're innumerable. You can't count them, there's so many of them. But it says that they sang together and they shouted for joy as they watched God, the creator, the authority, the one on the throne, put together the universe. And even before time as we know it on the earth, and we see the creation in Genesis chapter 1 of the earth, the recreation, I'm going to say, because we're going to see that's what it is. The planet Earth always had a special interest with God, even before the continuum of time, the dimension of time was added as one of those dimensions of that continuum. planet Earth always had a special interest, and the angels knew this because here in Job we're reading about him. He's specifying on the Earth right now, even though the universe was created and all the other planets and the galaxies and the stars and all of that. That was all done as well. As the angels beheld this, they watched this, they sang together, and they shouted for joy. Just think for a second. I'm going to stop there. And as I stop there, I want to go over to Ezekiel chapter 28. Because in Ezekiel 28, we're going to pick up a little bit more detail of what that time it was like. And I'm not even really going to say time, and because the continuum, the dimension of time was not in this space right now. It was everlasting. They didn't have no time to go by. You can say that you can measure time from one event to the next. But so they had time as like that, but they didn't have time as a constraint that we know it by. And so you have all the angelic creation singing together and shouting for joy as God's putting together the universe. In the book of Revelations, it says that all things, and that term we're going to see has to do with the governmental authorities of rank, seats of authority, rank and structure, were created by God and for him, for his pleasure. In that God, as the angelic being beheld him creating the universe, there was a purpose. God didn't just willy-nilly start doing all this stuff. He had a purpose. He had a plan, and he was beginning to execute his plan through creation. These angelic beings that were already there, that he created before he put together the universe, they had a purpose in the universe. They had a purpose in helping God rule over the universe through different governmental seats of authority. Now, that's the thing when I talked about God being the authority on a throne. People always kind of want to buck against that because we don't like authority. The reason why we don't like authority, because most of the time, authority is corrupt. It's unjust. We all long for justice, don't we? We all do. Of course we do. But we don't see perfect justice on this earth. Most times we see imperfect justice that's used for self-serving purposes. But God's justice is perfect. It's not self-serving. His justice, as he's putting together the universe, he was the one on the throne, and the angels would have different positions of ruling and authority, that God would rule the universe, the known universe at that time, through the angelic creation. In his real life, like the angels aren't like just robots, or they're just like these animals or controlled beings. As we're going to see, the angelic creation are in some sense like the human creation, in that God created them like us as free moral agents with a free will. The angels weren't just robots and God created them, they just do what he says. They were created with a soul that has a will and volition. And they had a commandment from God. There was orders from God that they were to obey and to follow the authority. And it was like us, we're all being tested in this life. God has a message for humanity today, and we've talked about this, that in this dispensation of the grace of God, the gospel of the grace of God that goes out, and it's all up to us on this earth now if we're going to believe that and trust that, or if we're going to buck against God's message for today for humanity. We're all being tested. Are we going to have faith, or are we not going to have faith in that? The angels had that same test. What was their salvation? What was the gospel that went out to them? That God was creator. He was the authority on the throne. They had to believe that, trust that, obey that. Now, this will make more sense when we read in Ezekiel chapter 28. We're going to add more detail just of what was going on before there was any evil, where all of the angels sang together and shouted for joy as they watched God, the authority, the creator, the one on the throne, put the universe together. There was no evil. There was no rebellion. It was all in harmony as they worshiped the creator. Sometimes I just stop and think, And like I like to go running. When I run, I really get into these deep thoughts about this stuff. And to think there was a time, well, again, a time. This was before time, but still in order of events where you measure time, where there was no evil. The human creation was not here yet. But the angelic creation worshipped God, all in harmony, and gave him the glory. That really happened at one point in the universe. Just stop and think what it must have been like. All we know on this earth is evil. We see it every day. We see it all of our lives. I'm not saying that's all we see. I mean, we can create good in our lives, but what was absent then, it's hard for us to imagine that there was no injustice or no evil. And it must have been awesome, right? So now we all know, though, it must not have lasted forever, right? Because we know on earth it's not like that. The whole earth is in harmony, worshiping God, right? And in obeying, the message for us today. No, there's a lot of rebellion towards God. And it's consistent with what I'm trying to say. Why? So in Ezekiel chapter 28, there's some marvelous things here to add some detail onto all of this. We're going to go down to verse 12 where it says, "Son of man, take up a lamentation upon the king of Tyrus." Now, when it talks about the king of Tyrus, we're going to see that this is speaking about someone much greater than the king of Tyrus, somebody who's controlling the king of Tyrus, and say unto him, "Thus saith the Lord God, thou sealest up the sum, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty." So this one he's talking about was full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. Who is it? Thou hast been in Eden, the garden of God. Is that the Garden of Eden that's spoken about in Genesis 3? Well, we're going to see. Well, we're going to see that this garden of this Eden here was the Garden of Eden was on the earth before time began, and that we see in Genesis chapter 1 and 2. He says, "Thou sealest up the sum, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty." Verse 13, "Thou hast been in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was thy covering, the sardius, the topaz, and the diamond, the beryl, the onyx, and the jasper, the sapphire, and the emerald, and the carbuncle, and the gold." And it says, "And the workmanship of thy tabrets and of thy pipes was prepared in thee in the day that thou was created. Thou art the anointed cherub, and I have set thee so. Thou was upon the holy mountain of God. Thou hast walked us up and down in the midst of the stones of fire. Thou was perfect in thy ways from the day that thou was created." Wow. So you had this one being that had the responsibility, he was called the anointed cherub, to cover the glory of God. And he had it right inside him. He said he had these tabrets, the pipes. God created this being that had this authority and had the responsibility. He had a built-in orchestra right within him. Remember, the sons of God sang together. This anointed cherub bellowed out in song, and the angels sang to this music in praise and glory to God. And this anointed cherub was covered with all of these different stones, for the glory of God shined through this anointed cherub onto all creation. And when the sons of God, when they saw this, they sang together and they shouted for joy. And just think what this would have been like. It would have been an amazing time. And it had to have been, and it just would have been awesome to have been able to have witnessed that. But again, in this, we're going to close here because, this is on a high note, because this just must have been an awesome time as God filled the space with creation before there was any sin or evil. So, but where I left off, and here, this is where we're going to close, and I'm just going to read something out of Genesis 1, and we'll close, but it will link together to our next episode. He says in verse 14, what I left off, "Thou art the anointed cherub that covereth, and I have set thee so. Thou was upon the holy mountain of God. Thou hast walked upon and up and down in the midst of the stones of fire." It says, "Thou was perfect in thy ways from the day thou was created." It says, till iniquity was found in thee. By the multitude of thy merchandise they have filled the midst of thee with violence, and thou hast sinned. And he says, therefore I will cast thee out of the mountain of God. There it is. Go to Genesis 1 and we'll close. There's the original sin. Again, this anointed cherub, it says his heart was lifted up. He didn't have a heart like, that was pumping blood through his chest cavity. No, that was his soul. He got lifted up because of his beauty. He was perfect in beauty. He was full of wisdom. And that beauty lifted him up with pride. Okay, and and we looked at the next episode, we're going to get into what did he want? Why wasn't he content in that unbelievable position that he had as anointed cherub? Well, we're going to see the temptation, and he gave into his own temptation, and he deceived himself into thinking that he could be like God. And that's the original sin, is pride. And we'll see that in just perfect detail. And that's the thing, the Bible can give you all of the detail of why and when all this happened. But I'm going to leave you with a thought in Genesis 1 here. It says, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Okay. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. So my question is here as we close, and we'll begin to answer this next episode. Do you really think that God created the heaven and the earth without form and void and in darkness? Or do you think that could be a result of something that happened to put it in that condition? We just read of creation in the universe, and we saw that the universe was not without form and void, and darkness didn't cover the face of it. No, we started to see the wonders of creation in the beginnings of God's purpose and plan in it. So why is it when you come to the book of Genesis in chapter 1 that you find the earth without form and void and in darkness? Well, I'll give you a hint. That anointed cherubim that we just looked at, that sinned, well, something happened because of that sin that caused this in Genesis 1. And this is a lot to think of here, even though we didn't read much. But it's a lot to try to get your mind around and contemplate. So you should look at some of these verses and just take some time and think about it. And so because when we go to Genesis 1, this is a part of the Bible most people know of, right? Oh yeah, Genesis 1, a lot of people have read this. But some of the stuff that I was just talking about that goes back before Genesis 1, a lot of people don't read about that stuff. So read Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. Think about why the earth is in that condition. And we'll begin to answer that next time. So until then. Thanks for joining me today on Rightly Dividing the Word of Truth. I'm Kevin Severio. Make sure to follow the show so you're notified when the next episode comes out. I want to invite you in on the conversation. You can interact with the show by visiting the description below. You can also contact the show by clicking the contact link below or send us a message on social media. Make sure to send this episode to a friend who could benefit from today's topics, and don't forget to leave the show a 5-star review. Thanks for listening to Rightly Dividing the Word of Truth. We'll see you next time.